Hello, history friends, and welcome to tonight's live stream review of answering the short answer question. How's everyone doing out there tonight? All right. So here is what I would like to accomplish tonight. When I do professional development, I always talk about session aspirations. For the students, dear teachers, are they supposed to post learning targets? That's a thing, and it's a good thing. But since when I'm doing a presentation, I'm only going to be doing this for an hour and then there won't be any follow up. I'm under no illusions that I'll know if I hit the target or not. But I do like people to know what I'm aspiring to. And what I would like is for people to be more confident. And if there's any teachers out there who are less confident when you're grading the short answer questions, becoming more confident will make you faster. So, faster at grading them. Okay. So we'll take a look at these items here, especially the third bullet. That will be the main part as we take a look. There we are. If we could just take a moment and in the chat, just let me know and let each other know, how do you feel about the short answer question? Is it something you feel good about? Like it's a good opportunity to show off what you know? Is it something where you feel like you need more work? Or you hear, more because you're worried about it or because you want to sharpen your skills? Like, how do people feel? You could use an emoji too if you want it. It doesn't have to be a whole bunch of words, but do want to kind of see how people feel. Some of you might be in AP US history too, and so it's same format. As I go through it, I might say a few things that are different. Yeah, the stimulus really matters. Mr. Little, that is correct. I like that. Yeah, how do other people feel? Or do you have a preference for ones with or without stimulus? I know Mrs. Castellanos, when she did her stream, though, she did one without stimulus, just questions, which is one way these things can happen. And then I used stimulus in kind of a mashed up way. Oh, okay. Well, you are in the right place, Sonny. I think that we're gonna have 3 questions to practice, and I've been scoring my own students, so I have some images of my own students' work here tonight, so that you'll be able to see. So let's take a peek. Interesting. I'd be curious. You can go ahead and elaborate on that, Jed. Why you like the visuals better, and did you feel the same way when you were in World? Just whatever your thoughts are there will be good. All right, so these are the basics for the short answer question. I'll go through them. We've done streams like this before, and so you can look at some of those in more detail, but you should just ask any question you have. You can ask it right in the chat with this size group, or if you put it, or if it's not maybe the right exact time to ask it, there's a little thing there that says ask a question. And that's where you can put your questions. So when you get each short answer question has 3 parts, and you'll do 3 of them on the test. There's like kind of 9 total parts on the exam. Although in class, it's not uncommon for me just to give 1, just so we can do some other things. One thing you should know is that you can do those parts in any order. Like if it's A, B, C, you can go B, A, C, C, B, A, C, B, whatever. I think those are the possibilities. You can do them in any order, and you can also, when you're taking the AP test, long ways off, but you can also do the questions in any order. Well, it's interesting, Jed. Okay, so that's one thing to know, is to know yourself. Like, what is it that you will find better? So in Jed's case, he might, if there's one visual, which there often is, one with text stimulus and one without any stimulus, you might do the visual one first. Just so you know, you can do them in any order. You can't mix them. Like, you shouldn't do part C from number 1 and then do part B from number 2. But you can do them in any order. And you can leave a few blank. The way the scoring works, if you get to like 6, 7 points, you are cruising toward a 5. Because, AP scoring, it's not like regular scoring. So you want to really just find the ones you can hammer. So you're just going to write them without a thesis or conclusion, but you do need to write actual sentences. And that's what you need to do. Okay. So on the exam, here's what it'll look like. And you do 3, like I was saying, although not every single person will do like all 3 of them. You should know that the questions that I wrote here are a combination of different formats. So these aren't replicas of what would happen on the AP test itself, but they contain a lot of the elements that people would use to do the short answer questions and to do some of the others. So I gave primary source text because that's a common thing for students to be analyzing. It's good practice. But on the AP test itself, the primary source will probably be a visual because then the text will probably be a secondary source, a historian talking. But those are difficult to do earlier in the year because they normally want there to be they normally consider multiple time periods, those questions. And then sometimes the question about the author of the passage is somebody who was alive in the 20th century. That's pretty common. And since we haven't gotten to that, it's hard to do kind of the contextualization of that author. So I kind of mashed a few things together, and I'll point out what I did there. This is a great thing to practice. So when Sunny says that they're going to work on this some more, that's great because it's going to pay off in all these other areas. The other questions in the class, but also really just moving forward, the kind of writing that you learn to do with the short answer question is the kind of thing that you do when you write in college. Like you might actually do these sort of short answers in a college class. I know in history classes that had tests that I did, they didn't all have tests, by the way. The history classes I did that had tests, that identify and give significance. That's a pretty common structure. And so the strategies that you might have been exposed to by your teacher, and you can just mention in the chat if you've seen either or both of these. They're both fairly common. Way to go at it. These are good strategies for college writing in general, for things that you could do to that you would just do when you're writing any kind of free response in college, where you're bringing in evidence and you are so to do that. I think ACE is a good way to structure an LEQ paragraph, where you're kind of doing that. If you think of a long essay question, that's what I mean. Like these skills, you're like kind of making the building blocks for an essay that you would be doing. So if you're making an essay, you want to answer the question and then have evidence and then explain it. And that is, if you're kind of doing that, you do that twice, you've gotten half the LEQ points if you do that fairly well. So again, I think these are skills, like certainly I want you to ace your short answer questions in class for the students. Like if you get one in class, I want you to do well in class, but also the things that you do, if you get good at those skills, it's going to help you to do these other kinds of things. So these things often come with sources. Let's take a look at some sources. I have here one of my favorite sources to use lately. In fact, I used it in my on-level world history class today, kind of taking a look at it. So this is one of those things like Jed was saying about getting engaged with the image. So this is a Portuguese, and it connects to one of the sources that I use. This is a Portuguese image, a map that was made and used just after the da Gama voyage and just before the voyage that's in the primary source text that I used with people. So why don't you take a look, and if people could just notice either questions or comments, what do you see or wonder about? Like what does it appear the Portuguese understood already by 1502, and where were even the best informed Portuguese completely or still fairly clueless? And what does that tell us? The first thing to do is always to notice. And I think for people who are looking to get better at doing these questions, one thing you might consider is what would happen if you slowed down a little bit? And that's different people have different situations. So, but what would happen if you just looked at things? So where do the Portuguese seem to have a fairly good understanding of, like, where does the map look right, if you will, right? And then, right, so that coast there, and so you can think, like, what's the context for that, right? So West Africa and Northeastern South America are defined, right? And so those are places the Portuguese had bumped into, so they have that pretty good shape, right? And then we get into Asia, and then what kind of happens? I kind of know what their target. Can you tell what the target is? Can you tell where they were trying to go from this map? This map, it looks to me that the aspiration was not to get all the way to China, right? That they were aiming to get to India, and India was well known to them. In fact, when Da Gama arrived in India, he bumped into like they weren't they were Moroccan merchants, I think, who spoke to him in Portuguese. So it's not like India was like inconceivable. So we can kind of see, but it does show West Africa more, more understanding than East Africa. So that's kind of part of the, that's part of the context here. Okay. So this was the source that people wrote about and analyzed there. And one of the tips that Jed and Ivana gave in their stream was that you really should like annotate the sourcing material. And here I have like where I got it from, the book I got it from in parentheses, but the material before that, there's just lots of clues in there for what you may be doing. So I'm going to show you them. So you can kind of see, what do you notice there in that text? This is an interesting source because it's probably not what it says it is, but it's probably still fairly useful. And the reason that historians, I think that it's useful is that so much of it, has been corroborated, that it makes us think that some of the other things are true. But it's also clearly wrong about some things. Like they don't really understand where the Red Sea ends and the Indian Ocean begins. So here's some annotations that Jed or Ivana did with some things that I noted. And so this is one of the things that you might do is go ahead and, like, when you get a stimulus, is to actually annotate the sourcing even before you start to look at the other things. Now here's the text. Now again, if you are interested, we'll go back like that so you can read it. If you want to have this up in another tab, if you click the Practice SAQ, the big green button, it'll open up a Google Doc in another tab with this there, and you can check that out. So these are the things that the Portuguese noticed and reported back. Again, we're not exactly sure who wrote this, but the information in the whole body of the work contains so much information that checks out that it does seem to be that the in-between details are there. But there's also clearly stuff that's wrong or kind of prejudiced, like they. So as you look through here, one of the questions is about context. So you might just look for, what kinds of things about the Indian Ocean do you already know? So a lot of people have there's a lot of people saying that they're in the early modern period. So you've talked about Indian Ocean exchange then, right? One person even up into the modern. Whoever that is up into the modern, by the way, I noticed on the intercom that some kids were already doing Age of Revolutions. So I scheduled a live review next week on Tuesday with Patrick Lassiter, who's very, very good at this, YouTuber, AP reader. So that's scheduled just for people like from those intercom conversations. So if you are in the modern period, we have some review content for you next week. Rest of the things are from the early modern period. All right, so what do we know? You can put it into the chat there. What do we know already about the Indian Ocean? When you hear Indian Ocean, what kinds of things might you be looking for to see if it's in the text or not? And then as you're reading, then you say, do you see those things? So here's some of the things that led me to select this source as I was reading through it. Things I thought, now I don't expect any student to recognize all these things. And I made this slide today after I'd read, like 100 kids answering this question. I've read the passage several times. So you should never think, if you're like, oh, I need to practice this, that doesn't mean that you'll all of a sudden see all these things, but you only need to find one. So if people talked about the monsoon winds, did you know there's Arabic merchants? All right. Any questions or comments on that source? Things that people would like to know, or things that seem confusing about that? Anything that would be unclear, when you're looking back at this here? If something comes up, you just drop it right in the chat, or you can go ahead and ask a question. I feel like, again, this is an unusual stimulus because on a short answer question, you're probably not going to get a primary source. But this is also practice for the multiple choice questions. And yeah, they can be this long, but they can also be shorter. I think on the AP test itself, they have a range of how many total words that are on the test that they're looking to hit. So if there is one this long, then that's going to be words that aren't somewhere else. So I think this is on the longer end. Don't know, maybe someone who took, I don't know if Jed's still here, but if you took the test last year, did this feel long to you? I know that Jed and Ivana thought this text was fairly challenging. So it's a good practice one. It might be a little more challenging than what you'd find on the test. So yeah, that's, working through that is part of the deal. All right. So I think there's maybe only one person who said they'd written the questions. So if you had, you can tell us what you think. So we're going to take a look at what people wrote and what worked. I'll tell you a little bit what I saw. So we had a lot of questions submitted. Now the average there of just about 0.8. That's actually not bad. I know Mrs. Longnecker was like, she felt like that was pretty good for November. Remember, the idea here is that these things are college level writing, but for especially 9th and 10th graders, if you're in 9th and 10th grade and taking this class, you still have 7 months of development of like intellectual development, like reading, growing your vocabulary, working with sources. So it's really no problem if you're not there yet. Of course, you want to get good as soon as you can. So that's why we're here, to help you out. But it's really important not to feel like you are behind or something. Yeah, so maybe this stimulus would be a little tough, but a lot of people were able to dig things out. So I'm going to give you a few tips like for that situation. And this is the first time I've used these questions in class. So I am kind of gathering feedback and I'll be refining the question. So just know that, that last bullet there, that's about, you only had 2 people grading them and we didn't calibrate with others. So that's going to affect the scoring. And then I'm not a committee of scholars and experienced teachers. Like that's who's going to be writing the actual AP question. So like in your own class, some of the practice questions that I create sometimes will be too hard and sometimes will be too, maybe sometimes too easy. So just be aware. If it seemed hard, that's okay. We're just practicing. But I do think that 0.79, that's double like what the first time we did this on Fiveable was. So I feel like that's great. All right. The most important thing that I would say students need to be sure they're doing when there is a question with stimulus like where there's words, is to say something specific that isn't in the passage. So if, for instance, you're just saying there was sailing or there were islands in the Indian Ocean, that's not specific enough. But specific here means to the content outside of the passage. So anything you know about the Indian Ocean, then you can bring that in. So really my advice for a situation like this, especially like Jed suggesting where the text might be a little difficult, is to start by looking at like, what do you know about the situation in general, where it is? And even if in this case, there's these 2 cities that you maybe read in your text, maybe you didn't, but it's part of the Indian Ocean world. That's one of the main topics in the whole class. So like, what is anything you know about that? And then can you find it in there? So then you're kind of playing hide and seek with things you know about the Indian Ocean. They're hiding in there and you're just looking for them. So try to start with what you already know. Okay. So for the first question, oh, right, yeah, there's the naval, yeah, oh, right, so that's a thing. Sometimes the question itself, so what Mr. Little's suggesting there in the chat is that the question itself, I mean, you have to kind of read that thing like an attorney. Like for this one here, it says interregional exchange. So that means that your example, it doesn't have to be real long. A student could write just one sentence and they would be able to get this point because it only says identify. But you would have to say something that moved between regions. So there'd have to be two different regions involved. And that's the AP regions. So North Africa and West Africa, those are two regions. So a lot of trans-Saharan examples earned a point here for students. But right, if it's if the question's asking about sailing, that's not the same thing as navigating. They're related, have that. So I'm going to show you a successful example here written by a student in my class, also a student in my homeroom, so I'm sort of doubly proud. Read that there. So she talked about the sugar. Now, some other students talked about the sugar, but they clearly were only referencing what was in the passage. And this is the one that goes with the Marco Polo, not the East Africa. So again, you click that practice SAQ down there and you can get the stimulus. So what is in here that what has the student identified? So it's not just the sugar. I read that sugar part and I was like, oh, that's not enough, but I just keep reading. Never worry if something you write isn't very good if you write something better after it. Because teachers, we want you to do well. We're rooting for you. Readers are rooting for you. Amanda, the Queen of Fiveable, is, described it like a scavenger hunt. You're just looking for, you're trying to find the things, for the kid. You're kind of rooting for the kid, right? So you can toss in the chat there if you see something there. What really sets this apart as being specific enough then? Now, I told my students before they wrote this question that they should be finished with the chapter in our book that includes the Italian creation of sugar plantations off the coast of Africa. So if you're like, wow, that is super specific, how did they know that? Well, because I said that you should finish this chapter, and this student clearly did. This is not something that they knew before they came into the class. Okay. But so going from West Africa to North Africa, and also the sugar cane itself diffusing. Here's another example from from one of the students who submitted that on Schoology. And this is somebody that's aligned with a completely different thing. So can you see in here where it's interregional? And in fact, just the first sentence here would have been enough to earn the point because it only says identify, so that answer can be shorter. So it did identify Indian Ocean and then talked about the two different regions, well, three regions really, East Africa, right, and the two places in Asia. So this is a question that's not dependent on the stimulus. It really just is identify interregional exchange. Don't use the stimulus. Yep, it does, right. So that's the thing, is be specific. Sometimes I write a big B and a big S on kids' papers if they're not being specific. Be, what is happening here. All right, here's part B, ask for this. And I bolded the word explain. I think on the AP test, you're probably not going to see identify and explain. The practice questions the College Board's putting out, I'll just say explain. Then the identify is implied because you have to explain something. But I kept them in here for this because then it would kind of cue students like how to go through the process. So again, this is asking for a cause of the interregional exchange. And so that's going to be something that's not in the text. The most frequent way that students didn't earn a point on this is if they just repeated things that were in the text itself. But this is really supposed to be like what's causing those things. And the stimulus might jog your memory or give you some ideas, but it is not going to provide the answer. I don't think that's right. Jed is dishing some serious advice in the chat. So that's why I like to keep identify in during this part of the year. Remember, you have to talk about one thing. Now, you don't have to talk the trade routes. In these questions, you always have some choice about what you're going to write about. And so one student wrote about Indian Ocean, another student wrote about North Africa and the Mediterranean. That's fine. That's great. So here's an example of one that was successful from a student who submitted. I think this could have been a context question too, and if I refine it for next year, as kids, I might think of it as a context question, and those things are related. So you can find the cause. Can you find the cause in here? And then can you find the explanation? Feel free to drop that in there. So here we have Mongols, very common. Mongols have thousands of uses, right? Oop, I did. So here we are. Now let's go ahead and take a look at what Part C asked. Now Part C was a question that I think was confusing for some students. I think there's a couple reasons for that. I'm guessing that not all teachers use this phrase sourcing. I have seen it in some like AP multiple choice questions, but I think, and Mrs. Longnecker was telling me her impression too, and she's very up on these things, that's not a term that necessarily everyone's using. So if that's a term that confuses you, I think that's okay, because that's more of a teacher term. But what the sourcing means is something about the source of the document. And so learning how to do that though is very useful. And that's where the HIP or happy or hippo thing comes in. And we have lots of replays. Jed and Ivana's replay, they go through their video, and other teachers, if you look under just AP skills, tomorrow night, Mrs. Longnecker's going to be doing a thing on the DBQ, and she will explain that. She'll explain it well too, because that's how she rolls. So we have the HIP here, or the happy. And so these are the aspects of sourcing. The first P was the most common way that students did well. And that was by identifying Marco Polo as a merchant. And then as a merchant, how does that affect the source, the document itself? Well, it affects the document because he's very interested in detail in his observations of commerce. And that's probably because he himself is a merchant, so he would notice those things. It's almost never a good idea to use words like bias, because all sources have that. And for the most part, we're not looking to judge whether sources are true or false. We're just looking to see how who the author is affects the document and how we might use it. So here, you would say, you'd make that connection. Let's take a look at some examples. I did one example here, okay? So the keywords in here is a documentation, the merchant Marco Polo, so he focuses on the economy of China. If I was to give, when I give students, when I actually do, not if I do, when I give students one tip on how to do this analysis of the sourcing of documents, whether it's for the DBQ or on short answer questions or even in the multiple choice, it's one thing I tell them is to think about words that are because or synonyms. So because, since, as. Here the student has used so. It's kind of like because he's a merchant, he focuses on the economy. And then they give an example from the text. Let's see, this is what, 2 sentences? Yep, those are 2 good sentences. So, and then this one goes, oh no, 3 sentences. They go the extra step and say, well, here's what it's not doing. But really, it's not the most important. I mean, you can do that. That's good. I think that's a good process. So, but the person could have had one of the last 2 sentences and still done okay. So that's the Marco Polo question. Any questions or comments on that? Do you think of Marco Polo? Did you read some Marco Polo in your classes? Is that something? The other source is something that I got out of a book. I don't know how common it, like a book of sources. But that Marco Polo, that's all over the place. So And other excerpts from his book have been on the AP tests in different forms. Christopher Columbus had a copy of the book when he sailed across the Atlantic. I mean, that book's a big deal. Oh, did you really? Oh, that is great. Was that fun? And maybe more importantly, did you dress up? I'd be curious what Marco Polo had to say at the trial. I've never done that trial of Genghis Khan. I know that it's fun, and I hear about kids who enjoyed doing it. Oh, but that was disappointing. You show up dressed up, you're ready to go. Wow, nice emoji game too there. That's strong. Okay, here's the other question that relates to the source we took a closer look at. And now this one is an interesting one because what you might notice is that you don't need the stimulus to do that. So even though we haven't looked at that stimulus now in maybe 20 minutes, you could answer this question just based on prior knowledge. This could be a question where there wasn't any stimulus. One thing that I noticed with this question was some students really overstated what happens when the Europeans came into the Indian Ocean world. And so that's an important thing to keep in mind as you're going through this time period in class, that this is not similar when Europeans enter the Indian Ocean world. It is not like what happens when Europeans enter the Americas, because there's no equivalent to the great dying with all those microbial deaths from the influenza and the smallpox and other pandemics that take so many lives. So Europeans do establish trading posts, and there is a kind of imperialism that's happening. So I say overstatement, kids weren't just making stuff up. There are things that are going on, but tended to either go too far one way or the other. So overstatement would be the way kids got it wrong, would be saying that Europeans came in and just took over the whole thing and there weren't any more Muslim traders, which that's not true. There was still a lot of Muslim trade. Or they would list things that weren't actually changes, they were continuities. So if you have a question on a test, this is a maybe better tip for multiple choice. If you have a multiple choice question that's asking you for a continuity, the wrong answers will be changes some of the time. You know how those AP questions are, the wrong answers are often actually true statements. So the wrong answers for a question asking about change continuities. What would happen for kids who did a good job is they kind of ignored the passage. So here's a student in my class who wrote this. The student was very happy because they got all 3 points on this SAQ. They're the only student in class who did. This was a reassessment opportunity in my class, so not everybody wrote on it. And so they were reassessing, and so that one there. You know how like an AP history class will make you feel rewarded by different things. You know, I have an 8-year-old, she's sitting right here coloring right now. She likes stickers and stars and all kinds of things on her paper. Then you get an AP history class and one little one. Just very pleasing. So if you take a look here, what's a change? So words that worked well here: trading empires, trading post empires, armed trade, the Cartaza system, which Mr. Little, who was here in the chat, his slides for the resistance, you know, we talked about that and how the Portuguese enforced that. So those would all be possible examples. That trading post-empire, that's a really key term to remember. So if you're using this to review some content, I recommend that. Okay. So question B then asked, and this is really a context question. And this would be one where I was looking at student answers, I think, so you've read the passage and highlighted some things. I know one tip that students have given other students is to read the questions first then before you read the passage, so you would know you're looking for context. I think an easier way to get this question right is just to start by brainstorming things you know about for a student, the things they know about the Indian Ocean before Europeans, and then just see which of those things can you find in the passage. So if a question is asking you to, what is it that what do you see? And you have to do two things. You have to have some outside information. So if you look at this question, it's asking you for outside information, but there is really a broad range of things that you could bring in. So any piece there of the Indian Ocean network be something, if you see that in the stimulus, you're fine. Mistakes that students made were either just restating things that were in there, and the source is from after 1500. So this is supposed to be, a context question. So like, what situation were the Portuguese moving into? When they show up, it's like, the story, Da Gama lands in Africa, and then he hires a local pilot, just like in this source, pilot like to run the ship, to take him across the Indian Ocean. So there's already this network. And then, as I mentioned, when he gets to India, he starts talking Portuguese, talking Portuguese to a couple guys from Morocco. So this is already a system that they're wandering into. Some students who get too reliant on the text also had East and West Africa confused, which is easier to do, it would seem, I think. Not sure what happened there with my animation. So here are two successful examples that you can take a look at and see. And then maybe let's just pause here for a moment and look through and see for the first one, what is coming in there, what's the aspect of context that they're showing. So we can just look at the top one. So what's an aspect of the Indian Ocean trade that you see there that the student who wrote this noticed? Okay, and you can drop something in the chat there if you see or notice something, or if you want to do the second one. What Indian Ocean things do we see there? So the top one mentions the top one there mentions that there's the East African city-states. So that's something you can associate with Indian Ocean. You can use that in a lot of examples. And then also some of the products that we're moving around, and talks about it being, a fairly peaceful trade. It is. That one is very detailed. Now, one thing to know, is that is more details than you would have to have. So you should know that if a student, like half of this would probably be fine. But having some of those details is what's important. So it's taking the idea of the East African coast. So that's a main idea. And then it's connecting it to the source. Well, here's two of those city-states that are there. And then it explains why they're important, because they're hubs for these different gold and Persian rugs. In fact, I think if this ended after the word porcelain, the top one, it would be fine. So you should know that. But since they had more time to write and maybe they were consulting their notes, which, by the way, is fine because this is just practice, they might have added that. So I think if this one ended at porcelain, it would be enough. So you should know that. And then in the second one there, it has the idea that there were Arabic traders, and those Muslim traders were in Indian port cities. And so then that would be something that's true of the Indian Ocean, that there were a lot of Arabic-speaking merchants, and that we see that in the passage. So it's a tough balance because you have to something and then see if it's in the passage. But my advice is to work backwards, and that is to think like, what do you already know about this area? And if you can't come up with anything, then look in the passage and see if that like jogs your memory. But if you can think of something about the topic that it's asking about, then you can find it in, and then you can look and see if you find it in the passage. Now, this question here, for some reason I left that rogue bullet point there. This question here was difficult for people, and again, it would probably be an explain question. A lot of students confused the idea of the limitation of the document, like the sourcing. It's probably my wording somewhat. Let me back up. So just, so it's not like a criticism of anybody who, missed this point, but this word limitation, Mrs. Longacre's really taught me this, that's a good word to use in terms of thinking about the sourcing, like what's the limit. So the mistake students made, or the misinterpretation, was that they would just talk about like what's not in the passage that was there, which is an excerpt. Some of the things the kids were saying that they wish was in the passage actually are in other parts of the document, like stuff about India and things like that. So this is really a sourcing question. So the fact that this is supposedly from the Portuguese king, and I showed you that map to kind of prime the pump for you to kind of get your brain working, thinking, well, what did the Portuguese not understand? They understood some things pretty well, like the coast of West Africa. They knew that Brazil existed, but a little sketchy. You get to the other side of Africa, it gets a little fuzzier, and then past that, real fuzzy. So it's like, what's the limitation of that as a source? Doesn't mean, again, that it's bad or fake or lying, but it does mean that, it's not, it's limited. So here's an example of a student who did that well. And I have two examples for this one because source is so important, analyzing the source in the document. So this student says, that's the point of view. So again, you want to think of that hip or happy. Do you all use hip or happy? Or something else entirely? And if you're just coming in, we're just analyzing the sourcing of this document so you can check it out. And then the question is acronym that you use in your class for talking about the different things. The important thing to know is that all those things those are just use hip. All those things are just pop. So with the hip, there's 4 things, and that's a menu. And all 4 of those things aren't going to work with every document, especially if you're taking a test and you're under time pressure, you're kind of stressed, and it's all right if you only see one. One is great. So this student here, it looks like they've been exposed to the hip or the happy, and they went ahead and said that it's the point of view. And then to explain that, the reader only sees one side of the story, and that side is the side of the King of Portugal. And so then that's good. That's identifying the limitation. They've identified that it's just from the Portuguese perspective, but then they have to explain how that limits. So it's hard to tell whether it's completely accurate or not. But so that's right, because it's only from that one perspective. But then it takes this other step, which is the explanation. Other articles, different sources, then we'd be able to figure it out. So this is one where really that second and third sentence are really quite useful to explain that. I also think, and again, this is something I've learned from working with other teachers here at Fiveable, the use of limitation is good when you're writing in the document-based question, or a shorter question where you're writing about a document. Instead of saying that something's biased or unreliable, you could say, here's how this is limited. It doesn't tell us, like, for example, how African people responded to the Portuguese. It can't show us that. That's just the limit of it because of, what it is. Okay, here's another example. You can see that how a student interpreted this. And if for people who've just come, if you want to see the stimulus that this is based on, like the passage, you can click on that green practice SAQ button, and that will open up a Google Doc. So here's a student, and this student was very pleased with what they did, which is great. I was really happy for them. So again, talking about that. It tells us they'd have no knowledge of what was in the North Indian Ocean. And the reason I like this one, you can kind of see my thing. Oh, is it? Should I just read it to you? Thank you. I wanted to put the actual picture in. So here's what the student wrote. In the passage, it only describes or talks about the Portuguese and their travels to Kilwa. But if a historian wanted to find out more about France's effects in the Indian Ocean, then basin, they would not be able to use this source. Using France as another example of Europeans, because it talks only of Portuguese traveling. So again, it's only talking about that. So that's a limit in Kilwa. Also, the Portuguese did not act with the city or sailors more north of the basin in the passage, which would show they had no knowledge of what was north in the Indian Ocean, since they traveled around West Africa. So what the student is saying is, because the route went around Southern Africa, that they went around West Africa, and the Portuguese had pretty detailed knowledge of West Africa. So they that meant they didn't come down the Red Sea side. Of course, there wasn't a canal, but there was a passage there. That they wouldn't know as much about that. So it's not just saying that that's not in the passage. It's saying because they didn't sail that way, then it doesn't tell us that. And I think the reason why I liked that answer from the student was because in other parts of the passage, which they hadn't read, it actually describes these places like north of Kilwa as being on the Red Sea, when they're not. They're on the Indian Ocean. The Red Sea doesn't go that far. Kind of completely missed Somalia. Like they had no idea about Somalia. The Indian. Okay. All right. Any questions about that that question there? Oh yeah, you're welcome. All right. We'd like to take a look at a visual question. I have a fresh question. If you are done, that is fine. Oh, okay. So here's a slide that Jed put together about analyzing images with the hip in there. And the advice he gives is to annotate the summary just like you would in, any other kind of question. So mark that thing up. Got my, sorry about that. It's all navigational issue. Okay. So these are things that you might look for in the image. Be the same kind of thing with the image. It's always like, who created it? So these will mostly not be photographs, which can get a little dicier. They'll mostly be things where you can actually, figure out, who made it. So I'm just going to show you an example, and then we won't write a question, of course, but we can just kind of take a look and see. And this is one that's probably a little more detailed than anything that you would, or the event itself. Let me just show you the picture and you'll see. I think this is really good advice. And this is, again, you can watch the replay, and I linked it down there under resources of Jed and Ivana talking about it. So what I did here is that I animated the slide so the picture doesn't come up yet. So I conclude just from the source information. And you might not have talked about Charles V. Like AP Euro, you would talk about him a lot, but this is AP World. But Reformation and religious war, those things are in the course and exam description. And I think some classes around the country spend more time than I do on it. So just from looking at this stimulus and the picture, or not the picture, the description, is Charles V a Catholic or a Protestant? It's all right if you're not right. You can guess. So if he was Holy Roman Emperor and the King of Spain, those were two of his titles. Can you guess how he would have fit into this conflict? Okay. Now here's the painting that was done. The other thing that's in there is that his court painter was this guy named Titian. All right, so you don't need to know who that is, but he was kind of a big deal as a painter. You can see it's a very nice painting. Okay. Charles V was one of the most powerful people in the world. So why don't you just go ahead and take a look and see, what do you notice in the picture? Is there anything interesting in the picture or a detail? So he's the emperor, and he told the painter to paint him exactly how he wanted to be seen. And how is that? How does he look here? How is he, portraying himself? Right. That's a good word for it. Charismatic. Sort of leader like. So that's probably because it's an official portrait. He's supposed to look good. So he's like, he looks like a leader. Yeah, and it's an interesting kind of, bravery and kind of looking. It's not really what warfare would have looked like at that time. Or it's really just a little past that. Okay. I put this map in here. You can kind of see Charles V controlled all these different places, plus the Americas, and the Philippines. Okay. The question here in the chat, or in the question box, from Iris. So I'm going to take a look at that. So you know what I'm going to do? Let me take a look at the next question, Iris, and then I'll start answering this, because that is really the key question. I think it's one of the things that makes doing these difficult for students. Okay, so here's 3 questions, and I'm going to go ahead to the next one, and then I'm going to take a look. And so I think the question there, how much is enough? That's tough, and that's why I was trying to tell you that in some of those other ones, kids had more than they needed. Okay, so let's take a look at this as an example. So I'm just going to say the question again, as I'll have it time-stamped for when people watch the replay, or if you want to skip to it. So how much evidence is enough to support your answer, so you don't waste time going into too much detail? And the short answer to that question is one piece of evidence. So like if you look at this here, it says identify one feature. Now you might need to include a little more specifics in terms of explaining how it connects, but just one thing will be enough. And there's no extra credit. One of the things I think that can be a little nerve-wracking for students about the short answer question is that, it's all or nothing. There's no partial credit. There's no, if you did really well on this one, then if the other one's just okay, you still get the point. There's none of that. But, so you got to be brave, like Charles V here, and just one example. So one feature of Europe in the 16th century could be anything. So what you would do then, if you were looking at this question here, is you would just think of, what are all the things you know about the 1500s? Yeah, so individualism. So have you studied like the Renaissance at all? That's one of the trends. Yeah, a little bit. That's fine. The Renaissance is not a huge topic in world history, the Italian Renaissance, but it is, right? And so so you could say this was a time when culture was becoming more individualistic. And you could even say as part of the Renaissance or not. And then how do you see that in the painting? So then you would connect that to the painting. So there, it's just one person on a horse, like it's just one guy. It's charismatic. So you have that one thing. Right? So to get to Iris's question, then you're going to have one thing, 2 parts. Like, what is it and how does it connect? And then a third part would be if you had to explain for the other parts. So other things that you might know from the 1500s, you might know that there was religious war. You see that in the picture because he's got what's he got there, like a lance? He's on a horse. Or you might know that there were a lot of individual countries. Or you might know that the Spanish were very powerful, and he looks very powerful in the picture. So any like one thing that you know would be enough to do it. Got to find my advancement here. Okay, so here's question B that I wrote for this. Now, this is one that's not dependent on the image at all, which is good because there's not tons to work with in the image. But you might see war, you might see power, you might see some Renaissance themes, like you saw with individualism. So this could be a long-term effect of the, of the Reformation, the conflict between Protestants and Catholics, and that would be something like that. A long-term effect might be that it kept Europe divided for a long time. There could be a short-term effect, like there could be more war, or like the 30 Years' War. So you would have to come up with some example, like you could say the 30 Years' War, or that there wasn't one German country that developed, or that Protestants and Catholics fought in the New World. You might know Spain. Yeah, I don't know. I have it here as B, in terms of where it would fit. Sometimes it does happen that would be the last one. Although sometimes, if you think of SAQ 1 from last year, which was the question about nomads and non-nomads, this was really kind of like the B question, which is like something that happened after the period. But yeah, I think this is hard. I'm just using this as an example. Like, I don't think you would not get a question this specific. This is something that was kind of part of my unit test, to see, like, did you read the chapter that covers the Reformation? Then you would just have to be one effect. You could talk about the formation of the Jesuit order. I talked about that in class. And then the Catholic Reformation and Jesuits going all around the world, let's say the country, all around the world, would be a possibility. There. Then here's a third question. And that's, again, to talk about sourcing. This is kind of the first question. But what you might consider here is, the aspects of the sourcing. So it's done during the Reformation. So it's a time of this heightened religious feeling. So maybe that's part of why he's portrayed so heroically. It's not that far from the Middle Ages, so he looks like a knight. And then I think the most significant aspect is who painted it. So this would be one when you're really looking at who the author was. So the author is this painter, and you don't need to know anything about the painter, like his background, but you know that he was the court painter. And then what that means is that he painted, he's the official painter. So is he going to show, like Charles V, like a lot of people in his family, had a very pronounced lower jaw. Like, he wouldn't have looked funny, I think, to a lot of people. But the painter's really kind of done that very subtly. Yeah, it's a family characteristic. There's a lot of people marrying close in the family. It's a family tree that maybe could use a few more branches. You know what I mean? And so you get some, what today we'd recognize as genetic problems from that, right? But so the painter has shown him as more handsome than he probably was in real life. And he's also shown him as heroic. Well, why is that? Why has the painter shown the emperor as heroic? Well, where does he live and work? Like, who's the audience? The audience is other people at court. So this is one of the most powerful men in the world. So he wants to look good, and he's paying his painter to make him look good. You might also know that this is happening. Some of the themes, like E mentioned earlier, like the Renaissance themes, like individualism, it has the perspective painting. Again, if you don't know these things about this part of European history, please do not worry. I just included this because I know that some classes go into this period in more detail. So it gives you a sense of how to do it. All right. That is all the content I have, and I've even gone over a little bit. So if people have any other questions or comments, things you'd like to know or wonder about, things that we're helpful or not as helpful? We feel better about the short answer question. And at the beginning, Sunny was saying that they felt like, something to get better at. But Sunny, I've seen you in some streams, so I know you're adding to your knowledge here. Remember the question Iris asked, it's like one good piece of evidence is enough. It really is a short answer question. You can get all three parts easily on one piece of paper. If you go over because you make a mistake, that's fine. We can deal with that, like both your teacher and on the AP test. But you don't have to. All right. Well, thank you very much for coming, and continue to think fiveable. If you want to take a little break and come back for more free response question action, Mr. Little, who's been active in the chat here, is going to be bringing the contextualization knowledge. And then tomorrow night, there's more DBQ with the reasoning point, which will connect to a lot of things that I was talking about here. So you should feel free to check that out. I'm very glad. And if you have questions, you should ask. I mean, you can drop them in that little walkie-talkie deal, and if you leave your email, somebody will get back to you, or lots of things. Yeah, Jed might even answer your question. There was an AP US history question, and I was a little down on the content. You just jumped right in there. That was awesome the other night. So really, you can do this, and just know if you give them 1 point on the SAQ now, you're in great shape. Because if you get 3 2s, 2 2 2 on the 3 SAQs, you're headed for a 5 on the actual exam. So thank you bunches for coming. I've really enjoyed doing this, and we'll see you down the line. Bye-bye.